Hello, I'm Nick Park from Evangelical Alliance Ireland, and welcome to another Knee Reaction. This is an occasional series where we try to look behind some of the most contentious news stories, the kind of stories that can provoke a knee-jerk reaction, where we sometimes come out with an instant response without thinking it through properly and sometimes without praying it through. And so the whole idea of the knee reaction is to spend time in prayer, get our hearts right, and try to hear what the Lord is saying and bring an evangelical perspective to these contentious news stories. And I'll be honest with you, with today's knee reaction, I could easily have come out with a knee-jerk reaction because I myself was very angered by something that happened just over a week ago whenever the Dáil, that for those of you outside Ireland, that's our parliament, Houses of Parliament, voted to remove the 3-day reflection period for abortions to be carried out. And when abortion legislation was introduced following a referendum in 2018, it was promised during the campaign that if the referendum passed, then there would be this 3-day reflection period where if somebody came wanting an abortion, they would be told, okay, now come back in 3 days, and if you still want it, we'll continue with the process. Now, EAI's position on abortion has been very clear the whole way along. We believe that the taking of any human life is wrong, and that includes the unborn life of a child. And we believe that is a sin, but we believe this goes beyond Christian doctrine, because even for those who are not Christians, they should still be concerned about this, because abortion is not just a sin according to theological doctrine. Abortion is a human rights violation. It's basically taking away life from the most vulnerable in our society, and there's no more vulnerable people than an unborn child in its mother's womb. Also, at the time of the abortion referendum, we never really had a debate about that issue, because what happened was the debate was more seen as almost like a pushback against religious influence on Irish society over the last 100 years or more. So, for example, there was a debate in the Dáil at the time about the proposed referendum, and most of the contributions to that debate did not deal with whether an unborn child was really a human life. When do you first become a human being? But the debate was all about things unrelated to abortion, bad things that people perceived the Catholic Church as having done in Irish history. And so, because of that unique moment in Irish history, we never really got a chance to debate the important issues about the life of an unborn child. And so we at EAI, we still want to have that conversation. We still believe that's an important conversation worth having. And we do want to support efforts to mitigate the effect of abortion on taking human lives in Ireland. Now, this 3-day reflection period was repeatedly promised by those advocating for a yes vote in the referendum in 2018. Basically, there were a large number of voters who just believe abortion to be wrong under almost any circumstances except when the mother's life is in danger. And that's why a third of the population still voted no. However, there were a large number of people who maybe instinctively don't like the idea of abortion, but were persuadable. And for these wavering voters, there was a lot of mitigating conditions were brought about to try to bring them on board. For example, there was the often repeated mantra that abortion would be safe, legal, and rare. Now, that was in 2018. In 2020, I was at a gathering of religious leaders with members of the cabinet and with the Taoiseach of the day, Leo Varadkar. And this came up when my friend Trevor Morrow from the Presbyterian Church said, Taoiseach, you said that abortion would be safe, legal, and rare. In the last year, there have been over 6,000 abortions. Would you call that rare? And the Taoiseach said, no, I wouldn't. And obviously, that's something we need to do something about it. Well, the government has done something about it in that abortions have now increased to over 10,000 abortions a year. And now, in removing this 3-day retention period, that's going to produce thousands more, according to the statistics we have on people who first make an inquiry and then change their mind after the 3-day reflection period. You know, it would be easy just to dismiss this as yet another cynical, broken promise by politicians. And certainly there is an element of this here. Let's get the result in the referendum and let's say anything in order to get that result. You could compare this to Ireland's equivalent to the infamous Brexit bus that promised that 300 million UK pounds would be spent on the National Health Service if people voted for Brexit. People voted for Brexit, and that money certainly did not materialise for the health service. Now, I do believe that when politicians break promises, that should have consequences. As we look around the world, as we see what's happening in some other countries, we do see that it's become more the norm. That it used to be that if a politician was caught out telling a lie, that they could expect to lose their job, be the end of their political career. Now it appears that politicians can lie again and again and remain in office, and people will keep on voting for them. That's sad. There's a biblical quote that comes to mind. It's from Isaiah 59, verse 14. So justice is driven back, and righteousness stands at a distance. Truth has stumbled in the streets. Honesty cannot enter. Now, in the debate over the week since that Doyle vote took place, I've seen this kind of interaction where people are saying, hang on, this is not what we voted for. And then others are saying to them, don't be silly. The 3-day reflection period was never mentioned in the referendum. The referendum did not mention a 3-day reflection period. The referendum was very simple indeed. It actually said provision may be made by law for the regulation of termination of pregnancies. And that's it. These other things were promised, but they were not part of the referendum that was voted on. But people trusted the politicians. Now, at the time, I was active in the campaign for a no vote in the referendum. I wrote 2 books on the subject, spoke at lost count of how many church meetings. I crisscrossed the country speaking at meetings in different towns and cities across Ireland. And probably the most contentious moment when I was involved in that debate was when I wrote an article for the Irish Times, in which I basically said, when you looked at the wording of the referendum, never mind all the promises being made about 3-day reflection periods, everything else, I said what we are being asked to do is to give politicians a blank check. That basically they can legislate whatever they want about abortion. And that has been proved to be true. Now, at the time, I was attacked for doing so. In fact, other Christians said it was terrible that the leader of the Evangelical Alliance is encouraging such mistrust of politicians. And I wish I could take even a tiny measure of pleasure or satisfaction in saying, I told you so. But I can't, because it's the lives of unborn children that are now paying the price. So, where do we go from here? Well, quite simply, we need to continue talking about the things that matter. We need to keep having the debate that we never had the opportunity to have about when a human life starts. You know, parents instinctively know that whenever they're expecting an unborn child, they don't say, oh, my wife's carrying a fetus. They say, my wife's carrying a baby. And so we have this instinctive knowledge that an unborn child is a little human being. And we need to talk more about that. And, it's one thing to change a law, but it's no point changing laws if the majority of the people support the law that you're trying to get changed. And so we need to keep having that conversation, and we need to see a change in people's hearts and people's minds. Now, there is, when we talk about these things, increasingly something I'm seeing happening is when people try to raise the issue of abortion and abuses of the law and unintended bad consequences of the law, people often respond with, look, we've already discussed this, we've already had a referendum, you lost, get over it. Nobody ever says that whenever the Eighth Amendment was introduced to the Constitution, that the people that wanted abortion to be legal should just accept that they'd lost and should get over it. They viewed it as quite reasonable that they could campaign to have the referendum changed, to have the ban on abortion removed from the Constitution. So it seems hypocritical that they were not prepared to just get over it, but are now telling us that we should get over it and accept that we've lost. So am I saying we need another referendum? Well, actually, I'm not, because a blank check cuts both ways. And if you look again at that wording that is now part of the Irish Constitution, it says provision may be made by law for the regulation of termination of pregnancies. In other words, the Dáil has the power to legislate whatever it wants about abortion. So it does have the power to remove the 3-day reflection period. We gave them that power in that referendum. However, the Dáil, as it stands, has the power to bring restrictions in. The Dáil has the power, for example, and I would love to see this happen, the Dáil has the power to bring in a restriction that, for example, where you have unborn children who have a disability that is not going to result in an early death, maybe something like Down's syndrome, where somebody can still live a very fulfilling life. So the Dáil could, as the law stands, if it chose, bring in a law that says, no, abortion is not permitted where there's a disability that is not absolutely fatal in early years. You know, we already accept that abortion should not take place for certain reasons. It's an absolute scandal, for example, whenever some countries were having large numbers of abortion carried out because their unborn child was female and they only wanted a son rather than a daughter. In many countries, that was therefore choosing to have an elective abortion because of the gender of the child has been outlawed, and quite rightly so. That's a terrible discrimination. And it's equal discrimination whenever that is applied to somebody because of a disability. We don't allow discrimination against disabled people in many other areas of life in Ireland, so we shouldn't allow discrimination against disabled people on whether they have the right to be born or not. And so the government could, the Dáil, could bring in legislation like that without any need for a referendum. In fact, legally, the Dáil could, if there were sufficient pro-life TDs in the Dáil, they could vote for abortion only to be available if the life of the mother is in serious danger. It wouldn't need a referendum. That's what happens when you give a blank check. So what do we do? Well, we need pro-life politicians in the Dáil. Now, when I say we need pro-life politicians, we need to be careful on this. I do believe we need pro-life politicians from all parties. I don't really care what political party they're in, but we do need people with strong convictions and people who value human life. Now, we do have to be careful on this because sometimes politicians will say they're pro-life, but then their votes and their subsequent actions are totally different. Now, this may be because they lie to get elected. That does happen with politicians sometimes. But it can happen because their views evolve. And I think we saw this back in 2018, where there were politicians who had expressed a strong pro-life view. And then they basically checked to see which way the wind was blowing. And they said, oh, my opinion on this has now evolved. So we do need to be careful. Just because a politician says they're pro-life doesn't mean they will stand up for the value of a human life. Also, we do need to be careful because this is not the only issue. It's an important issue, but we at Evangelical Alliance, we are not about just one issue. We're not a single issue organization. We do believe this is important. We should not forget about the issue of abortion, but it's not everything that we're about as an organization either. And we do need to remember that sometimes a political party or a political individual can claim to be pro-life when they are anything but. And the biggest lesson on that is that the Nazi Party in Germany said they were pro-life. And one of the first things they did when they came to power in 1933 was to bring in a law banning abortions. Subsequently, we obviously know they were anything but pro-life. So I personally, for example, could never vote for a political candidate, even if they say they're pro-life, if they're expressing views of hatred and trying to divide Irish society against one another. So here at EAI, we're not saying abortion, that discussion is finished. We're not going to talk about that anymore. We will continue to stand up for the value of human life. We're not a single issue organization, but we intend to keep having the conversations that matter. We intend to keep engaging with people, both Christians and non-Christians, and to see human rights upheld and restored in Ireland. And I ask you to pray for us and to support us as we continue to do that. God bless you. EAI is working on your behalf to equip, connect and represent the Church of Jesus Christ in our nation, providing resources and speaking into spaces where God's people need to be heard in our society today.
I'm here to ask you to join our mission. We're looking for 1,000 people who will commit to giving just a pinch more than the price of a cup of coffee per month. By using this QR code, you can sign up to support the work of EAI with just €5 per month.
It is so important at a time like this to have a Christian perspective being spoken boldly into the political and social spheres in which we are living. Why? Because when we are together, we thrive, we grow, we make a difference.
Your generosity is needed to keep our mission moving forward. Be one of the 1,000, just €5 a month. God bless you.